"Can you pretend to be my husband just for one night?" That was the first thing she said when she walked into my cabin, in the middle of a snowstorm so thick it felt like the whole sky was falling. She wasn't shaking from the cold. She was shaking from fear. I remember it clearly, the oil lamp flickering in the corner, throwing a weak glow across her face, streaked with road dust and melted snow. I'd never seen someone look both so fragile and so strong at the same time. "My name's Jonas Hale. Folks around Cold Creek call me the quiet lumberman, the man who keeps to himself up north, where the trees are tall and the winters are long. I've lived with silence so long, I sometimes forget what a human voice sounds like. But that night, her voice cut through the wind like a warm blade, trembling, low, but carrying something that made me stop breathing for a second. She stood in the doorway, clutching her coat tight. Beside her was a little boy, maybe 7, thin and pale, holding a small wooden horse like it was his whole world. Her voice dropped to a whisper, almost as if she was afraid someone might hear her. "Someone's looking for me. I can't let them know I'm alone. Please, just for one night. Pretend to be my husband." I didn't answer right away. She looked up at me with those dark eyes that had seen too much to still be afraid of pain. I set my axe down, wiped my hands on my jacket, and met her gaze. The light between us swayed, golden, weak, alive. I don't know why I did it, but I nodded. Just one nod. "That's how everything began," she exhaled, a sound like relief and sorrow tangled together, and whispered, "Thank you." I invited them in. The boy clung to her side, glancing around my small wooden cabin where the only warmth came from a small fire in the stove. Her name was Mara Ellison. Her voice trembled, but there was warmth in it, the kind that told me she once knew how to sing, to laugh, to hope. I put a kettle on the stove and handed her a dry blanket. "You live here alone?" she asked. I nodded. "My wife's gone." She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry." The way she said sorry wasn't pity. It was understanding, like she'd carried the same kind of loss herself. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks. I added more wood to the fire. The boy sat near it, eyes fixed on the flames like they were magic. I looked at the two of them, strangers, lost in the night, and realized that for the first time in years, my house had the sound of another heartbeat. After a while, she pulled out a crumpled paper from her pocket and said softly, "If anyone comes, tell them I'm your wife. They won't question it." I asked, "Who's looking for you?" She hesitated. "The family of my ex-husband." That stopped me cold. Not out of curiosity, but because in this part of the country, ex-husband usually meant a man who drank too much, hit too fast, and believed a woman was something to own. "They want my son," she said quietly, eyes on the floor. "He's gone, but they still want to keep the boy for what he represents, for what he's worth." I looked at the child by the fire, clutching his wooden horse so tight his knuckles were white. "How far have you come?" I asked. 3 days, she whispered, "and I've got nowhere else left to go." The fire cracked, the only sound between us. Finally, I said, "You can stay here for one night." She looked up, and in her eyes there was a flicker faint, like snow melting under sunlight. "Aren't you afraid of what people might say?" I smiled faintly. "Out here, there's more snow than people. Gossip melts faster than ice." She smiled then, tired, but real. The boy laid his head in her lap, falling asleep. She tucked the blanket around him and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Hale. I owe you a kindness I can't repay." I shook my head. "No debts here. I just don't like seeing anyone shiver in the dark." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, watching its glow dance across the wooden walls, listening to the wind outside and the quiet breathing of two souls who had somehow found their way into my empty home. For years, this cabin had been nothing but wood and silence. But now, there was warmth not just in the stove, but somewhere inside my chest. Outside, the snow kept falling, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't mind the winter anymore. By the next morning, the snow had stopped. The first light pushed through the fog, spilling across the white rooftops of Cold Creek. I woke early, same as always, but the cabin wasn't quiet like it used to be. There were soft footsteps in the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, and a warm voice, gentle as the morning itself. "Coffee's ready, Mr. Hale." Mara was standing by the stove, wrapped in the wool shawl I'd given her the night before. The morning light came through the window, catching the copper tones in her hair. At the table, the boy was lining up pieces of firewood, pretending they were a train. The scene was so peaceful, so ordinary, that for a moment I almost forgot there'd been a storm at all. I walked over as she poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs. Her voice was soft, like she was afraid to disturb the quiet. "Did you sleep?" "I'm used to staying awake," I said, my voice rough from the cold. She smiled faintly. "And I'm not used to feeling safe." That stopped me. We sat by the window, coffee steaming in our hands. Outside, a few riders passed along the road, their horses' bells jingling faintly through the frost. Mara glanced toward the window, her expression tightening. She reached up and pulled the curtain down. "I'm afraid they might recognize me," she whispered. I looked out through a crack in the curtain. 3 men had stopped their horses in front of the Cold Creek saloon, talking to the gatekeeper. Long coats, rifles slung over their shoulders, not locals. I knew their kind, the sort that followed a trail until it bled. "You think they're looking for you?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "They always are. I never know if it's for money, revenge, or pride, but they never stop." Her voice carried something that hit deep in me, something I recognized. The sound of someone still running from a past that doesn't know how to die. The boy wandered over and held out his wooden horse. "Mister, what do you do for work?" "I cut wood." "Then you must be real strong." "Used to be," I said. "Now I'm just strong enough to split kindling." He laughed, a light, honest laugh that filled the room better than the fire ever could. Mara smiled at him, then at me. Her eyes said thank you, though her lips stayed still. By noon, I went out to fetch water. The air was knife cold, snow cracked under my boots. When I came back, I saw a wagon moving slowly down the main road. 2 men in it were scanning the houses, their eyes sharp. One had a scar across his throat. I'd seen that kind of scar before. Men who lived by the gun usually carried one. When the wagon rolled past, I stepped inside and said quietly, "There are strangers around. You should stay in here." She nodded. "If they come, you'll still tell them I'm your wife?" I looked at her for a long moment, then said, "At this point, I don't think I'm pretending anymore." She froze, then smiled faintly, her eyes bright but silent. That afternoon, I headed down to town to deliver lumber. When I passed the saloon, I heard the whispers start. "You hear? Widow Ellison spent the night at Jonas Hale's place." I knew it. The man never opens his door for nobody. Guess a warm blanket wasn't the only thing keeping him busy. Laughter broke out across the room. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, the weight of the lumber steady on my shoulder. The wind picked up, scattering their words into the dust. But I knew better. Words die fast in the air, yet their shadows linger a long time in people's eyes. When I came home, Mara was sitting on the porch, mending her boy's coat. She looked up and smiled, like nothing had happened. But I saw the sadness in her eyes, the kind that comes from being judged too many times to still be hurt by it. I dropped the firewood beside the steps and sat down next to her. "They're talking in town," I said. I figured. I don't care. I'm used to it. We sat in silence for a while. Then she said softly, "I used to think, if someone would just stand beside me even once, I'd stop being afraid of the whole world. I looked at her. She was watching the sun set over the hills, the light spilling across her tired, beautiful face. Maybe, I said. The world only needs one person brave enough not to be afraid with you. She turned toward me then, and for the first time, her smile wasn't sad. That night, the cabin was quiet again. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackle of the logs and the sound of her voice from the next room, softly singing her boy to sleep, her voice trembling but warm. And I realized something. Some truths don't need to be spoken aloud. You just feel them, the way you feel your own heartbeat. By morning, the town of Cold Creek was already full of talk about the lumberman and the widow. But inside that little cabin, there was only one truth worth knowing. I wasn't alone anymore. That evening, the sky looked strange. It wasn't the clear blue it usually was, but heavy and gray, like it was covered in cold metal. I remember because the wind had stopped. And when the wind stops in Cold Creek, it usually means trouble is coming. I was splitting wood behind the house when I heard the sound of hooves, slow, steady, deliberate, the kind of rhythm that belongs to a man who's been riding for miles. I stepped onto the porch, axe still in hand. A man in a brown leather coat, dust coating his shoulders, stopped at my gate. He was tall, bearded, with a long scar down his neck, like a burned rope. I recognized him right away. He was one of the men I'd seen the day before on the road to town. He looked at me, then passed me toward the cabin. Jonas Hale? Depends who's asking, Ho, I said. He smirked. Someone told me the Ellison widow's been found here. That name, Ellison, fell from his mouth like a knife. My grip tightened on the axe. No one by that name here, I said slowly. Just me, and if you came for firewood, the store in town sells it cheaper. His eyes flicked past my shoulder toward the door, then back to me. He laughed once. I'm not here to buy anything. I came to take back what doesn't belong to you. Before I could answer, the door opened behind me. Mara stood there, holding her boy in her arms. She didn't say a word. Her face went pale like she was seeing a ghost. Hello, little sister, the man said, his voice low and scratchy. Didn't think you'd run this far. I looked at Mara. She pulled her child close, her voice trembling. He's lying. That's my husband's brother. It all made sense. Men like him saw women as inheritance, property to claim, even after the husband was gone. He hadn't come for family. He'd come to take control. I stepped forward, putting myself between him and the door. You should leave. There's nothing here that belongs to you. He gave a dry laugh. Who do you think you are, some kind of savior with an axe? You know how much she owes? Her husband's dead. Half the ranch belongs to my family. The boy too. The child clung tighter to Mara's coat, eyes wide with fear. Mara whispered, He's lying, Jonas. He has no right. I said, She's under my roof, as my guest. You turn your horse around before I lose my patience. He raised a brow, staring coldly at me. You'll regret that night, lumberman. I didn't answer. The wind picked up again, blowing snow across the yard. He pulled the reins and turned his horse, his voice drifting back through the storm. I'll be back, and next time I won't knock. When the sound of hooves faded, I heard Mara's shaky breath behind me. She dropped into a chair, clutching her son like she was afraid he'd disappear. I set down the axe and knelt beside her. You all right? She shook her head, eyes wet. He won't stop. I know him. He used to hit me, hit my husband too, said if I ever left, he'd treat me like stolen property. I didn't speak. Some things don't need to be asked when the truth's already written in the way someone's voice breaks. You're not property, I said quietly, and that boy isn't anyone's debt. Her eyes trembled. You don't understand, Jonas. Out here, the law doesn't protect women like me. I stared at the dying fire. Then I will. She shook her head softly. I don't want anyone else dying because of me." "No one's dying," I said firmly, "but someone's going to learn how to walk away." She didn't answer, just looked at me for a long time, like she was trying to believe the words. The wind outside began to moan, making the door rattle. I stood, bolted the lock, and took down the old rifle hanging above the hearth. I brushed the thin layer of dust off it. Her eyes followed my hands, caught between fear and trust. That night, I stayed by the door. Mara and the boy slept in the back room, the door half open. I could hear them breathing, slow and steady, and I told myself, if he came back, I wasn't letting him take her. Not when she'd just begun to believe she could be safe again. Close to midnight, hooves echoed again outside. This time, more than one horse. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand. 3 men in black coats stood in the yard, snow swirling around them. The one with the scar raised his hand. "Send them out, Hale. I don't want blood on this ground." I took a deep breath, voice calm but cold. "Then you'd better turn around. Because if you take one more step, there will be blood, but it won't be mine." He laughed, sharp and ugly, and reached for his gun. Before I could fire, the door behind me burst open. Mara stepped out, holding a lantern high. The golden light hit the snow, and for a second, everything froze. "Stop!" she shouted. "What more do you want from me? I've lost everything already." No one answered, only the wind. I stepped up beside her, rifle raised, shoulder to shoulder. "Go back inside, Mara," I said quietly. She shook her head. "No, I'm done running." And in that moment, as the snow began to fall again, I realized she wasn't the frightened woman I'd met that first night. She was standing tall, in the freezing dark, protecting her child and the little hope she had left. I squeezed the trigger. The bullet hit the ground just in front of his boots. He flinched back. "Next time," I said, voice low, "I won't miss." He glared at me, eyes full of hate, then yanked his reins and rode off. The others followed. The sound of hooves faded into the storm. When the silence finally settled, I lowered the gun. Mara was still beside me, tears running down her face, but they weren't tears of fear. They were relief. "You all right?" I asked softly. She nodded slowly, voice trembling. "I think I just started living again." And standing there, in the snow and the wind, I realized something. She wasn't the only one who'd come back to life that night. After that night, the wind changed, blowing down from the north, cold enough to crack the wooden doors along their grain. People said that winter in Cold Creek lasted longer than any before, but I think time only stretches when you have something left to worry about. I never saw the man with the scar again, but I knew he was still out there somewhere. Men like him don't disappear. They wait. I set traps around the cabin, hung wind chimes by the porch, and taught the boy how to tell the difference between hoofbeats. He learned fast, giving names to the birds that flew past the window. Every evening when I came home, he'd ask, "Mr. Jonas, does the snow smell different today?" As for Mara, she started to smile more. She fixed the roof, stitched new blankets, even planted a few pots of dry chrysanthemums by the porch, something no one ever did in Cold Creek in the middle of winter. "They won't bloom," I said. She smiled. "That's all right. At least they're trying." Each morning I went into the woods to cut firewood. Each afternoon she lit the fire and brewed tea. We lived quietly inside our small world, as if the world outside had forgotten the road that led here. But in that quiet, something was changing. Slowly, gently. Something I couldn't quite name. I found myself listening for her laughter more than the sound of the axe hitting wood. She learned to recognize my footsteps outside the door before I even knocked. The boy once called me Pa by accident, then blushed and apologized. I only ruffled his hair and said, "That's all right. You can call me that if you want." She was in the kitchen then, and I saw her pause, not saying a word. One morning, While I was starting the fire, she came over and handed me a cup of coffee. Her hand brushed mine. Not on purpose, but she didn't pull away either. We both went still. Only the fire popped and the wind howled outside. I looked at her hands, small scars, rough spots from work. Hands that used to tremble from fear, now warm and steady. And I realized that the most beautiful parts of a person aren't the ones unbroken, but the ones that cracked and still refused to fall apart. That afternoon, I went down to the creek for water. When I came back, smoke was rising from the distance down near the main road to town. My chest tightened. I ran back. She was standing on the porch, pale as snow. The door had been smashed, the hinges bent. "Are you hurt?" I asked. She shook her head. "No, they just burned the stable. He left his mark." On one of the charred boards was a deep cut shaped like an R.U. Russell Dean. I knew what that meant. He wasn't done, and he wanted me to know he could still reach us. That night, snow fell again. She sat by the stove, staring into the fire. I sat across from her, cleaning the old rifle. Finally, she spoke. "I used to think if I ran far enough, the past would lose its way, but maybe it travels through the heart." "Then maybe," I said, "it's time we find a new heart." She looked at me, her eyes shining with something fragile and fierce at once, like a flame fighting not to die. "Jonas," she whispered, "if something happens to you, what will become of me and my boy?" I smiled faintly. "Don't worry about that. I've lived through blizzards, through war, through nights with nothing left worth waking up for. A man like me doesn't die easy." She laughed softly, then tears came. "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of losing again." That stopped me. I wanted to reach out and wipe her tears, but my hand froze halfway, close enough to feel her warmth, thin as breath. We stayed like that until the boy woke up, ran to us, and wrapped his arms around both. "Don't cry, Mama," he said. "The snow will melt soon." I looked out the window. The wind had softened. The moonlight lay across the white hills like silver cloth, and for a moment, I believed the boy was right. Snow always melts if someone keeps the fire burning long enough. The next day, I carried my rifle when I went into the woods. Not out of fear, but because I finally had something worth protecting. I hung a small wooden sign by the porch, carved with my knife. "This house belongs to no fear." At night, Mara read to the boy. I sat outside, listening to her voice, slow and calm, every word fading into the wind. When she closed the book, I heard her say to him, "Tomorrow the snow will stop, and we'll bake bread." I smiled and watched the smoke rise from the chimney. I didn't know what the future would bring. I only knew that this winter, the longest one Cold Creek had seen, was the first in many years that I didn't want to end. Because in that white, frozen silence, I'd found something I thought I'd lost forever. A reason to stay. Spring came slowly to Cold Creek. The snow didn't melt all at once, but patch by patch, leaving streaks of wet brown earth where warmth crept shyly through the cracks in the old cabin walls. I remember that first morning when I didn't have to start the fire right after waking up. Somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing, its voice light as a memory returning after a long sleep. I was fixing the roof of the barn when Mara brought me a cup of warm water. The early sun touched her hair, turning it the color of honey. She said, "See, the snow's finally gone." I smiled softly. "Yeah, guess it got tired." She shook her head. No, I think it just decided to make room for something else." She looked down at her hands, a few fingers still wrapped in white bandages from mending the door the day before. She was getting used to life here. The boy ran around the yard with a rope in hand, pretending to be a cowboy. And me? I was starting to fear something new, that when spring truly came, they might leave. That afternoon, as the air began to warm, I saw a lone rider appear on the trail. I knew him right away. Russell Dean, alone. His coat was worn, his horse exhausted, his face hollow. He wasn't the proud predator I'd seen that winter. He rode up close but didn't draw his gun. I stood there, my hand resting on mine, but I didn't lift it. He stopped a few steps away. His voice was rough and tired. I didn't come to fight, Hale. I came to talk. That's a hard thing to believe. Believe what you want. I'm tired. I just want that woman to know I sold the ranch. I'm heading south. I looked into his eyes. There was no malice left in them, only emptiness. Why? He spat into the dirt. Because I had a brother who was a bastard, and I hate the man I see in the mirror. She doesn't deserve to be afraid anymore. He turned his horse and rode away. I didn't stop him. When his figure disappeared over the ridge, I felt the wind shift, and I knew the last breath of winter had finally left Cold Creek. When I walked back inside, Mara was standing at the door holding a scarf she'd sewn months ago. He's gone. Yeah, I said, and maybe this time for good. She sat down slowly, letting out a breath she'd been holding for years. I never thought I'd hear that. Feels like a nightmare melting in the sun. I sat across from her. Now you can go wherever you want. Cold Creek was always just a stop on your road, wasn't it? She stayed quiet for a long time, then said, I'm not sure I want to leave anymore. That one sentence filled the whole cabin with warmth. I didn't look at her right away. I just kept carving the piece of wood in my hands. So what do you want? Her voice was soft, like wind brushing through the door. I want to stay somewhere a man keeps his promises. I glanced up. I don't remember making any promises. She smiled faintly. You did, that night, when you said yes. I laughed, the kind of laugh I hadn't heard from myself in years. I'm not good at keeping people, Mara, but I can keep a promise. That spring, we planted the garden again. The soil was damp, carrying the scent of new grass and smoke from the stove. The boy chased sparrows across the yard. I built a new fence while Mara hung a wooden sign on the porch, the Hale Inn. The handwriting was soft and slightly uneven, but beautiful. One evening, she handed me a folded piece of paper. Remember that letter I told you about? The one I never sent? I nodded. This is the second one, and this time, I want you to keep it. I unfolded it. Inside was a single line. If love is just pretending, then I pray our pretending never ends. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my coat pocket. She stood there, smiling faintly, eyes glistening in the evening light. I said, maybe we're not pretending anymore, Mara. She looked at me and whispered, then Jonas, can you pretend one more time? I'm listening. Pretend to say the words you've never said before. I stepped closer, close enough to hear her heartbeat, and murmured, welcome home. She began to cry, but the smile never left her face. Spring came late that year in Cold Creek, but it was beautiful. Under the porch, the dry chrysanthemums she'd planted in the dead of winter had finally sprouted. Every morning, I'd water them, watching the light pour through the leaves, and I understood something. Some things only come alive after they've survived the cold. Sometimes in town, folks still talked about that night. Remember when the lumberman pretended to be the widow's husband? They'd say. And whenever I heard it, I just smiled. Because for me, it was never pretending. It was the night a heart that thought it had turned to stone learned how to beat again. Some stories from the West were never written in books. They were kept alive through memory and kindness. Jonas Hale, a quiet lumberman, never found love in the wild, reckless years of his youth. He found it in a snowstorm, in the trembling eyes of a woman who had lost everything. And Mara, the widow the world had turned its back on, learned to trust again, not through promises, but through the warmth of someone who stayed. Love doesn't always have to be grand. Sometimes it just needs someone patient enough to wait until the snow finally melts. If tonight's story softened your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Tales from the Wild West, where we tell love stories long past but never forgotten. Because here, in this land of wind and red earth and quiet loneliness, every story is a reminder. It's never too late to be loved. One more time.